This episode is brought to you by Brilliant. Let me tell you how it works. Brilliant helps you get smarter every day with thousands of interactive lessons in math, science, programming, data analysis, and AI. And as I mention often on the show, I'm constantly engaged in learning when I'm not recording new episodes or editing articles for Skeptic or working on my next book. And my favorite platform by far is Brilliant because I can use it right on my phone. For example, today I went to the new course on circuits, electric circuits. Yeah, it's super cool. Do I know anything about this? Not really. So it was really fun to do this. And so they give you little lessons like how to close a circuit, electric circuit. So they show you a battery, they show you a little light bulb, and then you have to, you just physically touch and close the circuits. And then you click on check to see if you got it right. And it says, yay, you got it right, correct. And I get little points for this as I work my way through the entire course. Then I hit continue, and then I get a way more complicated one with like 4 different switches. Anyway, I managed to get through this amazingly enough, and it was great. And so this is why I strongly recommend you taking this up. Because Brilliant science courses help you make sense of our universe at every level. Just electric circuits. You can take courses in mechanics, machines, mind-bending physics, black holes, all this stuff. So to try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/skeptic or scan the QR code on screen here, or just go to the show notes and you'll see the link in the description. And there you'll get an additional 20% off an annual premium subscription. So check it out, brilliant.org/skeptic. You won't regret it. Matt, how you doing? Nice to see you.
Michael, it's great to be on the show. Huge fan of yours over many years, and The Skeptic is such an amazing achievement.
Before we get into the new book, do you want to take a victory lap for your previous book? I mean, the lab leak hypothesis is looking more and more like you called it years ago.
Yes and no. The number of people who say that to me is increasing dramatically. You know, come on, you've won that argument.
Yeah.
But the scientific establishment hasn't budged an inch. So, you know, Alina and I keep submitting papers saying, here's the argument for the lab leak, a review, please will you publish this? And journal after journal turns us down. They used to say, it's a conspiracy theory, you're lying through your teeth. Now they say, well, everyone knows that, so it's not worth publishing. So in that sense, we've won the argument. But, you know, we need nature, science, the Royal Society, the National Academy, to front up and say, actually, you know, it's more likely that it was a lab leak. There are implications for that. There was a meeting just ended at the 50th anniversary of the Asilomar conference, which set limits on biotechnology. And they didn't invite anybody who was remotely of the view that it was probably a lab leak. They invited some people who've been very vocal saying it wasn't. So there's a real problem here that the church is not admitting what it got wrong. And, you know, it's really bad for the reputation of science. Like you, I'm a huge fan of science, but only when it's prepared to admit when it's wrong.
Why? What is it about this particular case that they just can't seem to do that?
Well, I think with 20 million dead plus, probably 28, 30 million, it's the worst industrial accident in the history of mankind if it came out of a lab. Nobody wants that on their bio, on their conscience. And so the psychological resistance to admitting that it's likely a lab leak is extremely strong in a small group of virologists who were definitely involved in some very risky experiments and supporting very risky experiments in Wuhan in China. But that doesn't, for me, explain why the rest of science, and I mean, scientists say to me all the time, of course you're right, but I daren't say so in public. So why is the rest of the science feeling it necessary to show solidarity with this one small group of scientists? That I don't understand.
Yeah, because it's not like the conspiracy theories, they did it intentionally as
Exactly.
a bioweapon. It's just accidents happen. So?
Absolutely. And if they, you know, if the scientific establishment had said at the start, this is a strong possibility, which is what they thought in private. We now don't know that from their emails. This is a strong possibility. It needs to be investigated. Until it is, and until the Chinese authorities come clean with what was going on in that lab, we can't rule it out. Then the damage to the reputation of virology would have been limited to quite a small part of the subject. Whereas as it is, I think there's a real risk that what's happened is this has hugely undermined the reputation of science generally. And you get, it's contributed to the success of RFK, who is now a rock star. I don't agree with him on many of his positions. I just can't see why, scientists themselves can't see the damage they're doing to their own reputation here.
Yeah, exactly. Why not say, well, we thought masks were a good idea, then we didn't, then we did. Or we thought we should close the economy down and shut schools and the beaches in Santa Barbara. I have to gripe about that. I mean, come on, hiking trails and beaches. And there was that case down in LA, I think it was in Malibu, where they actually pulled over and arrested a paddleboarder out on the ocean. Like, we've got you now. It's like, oh, really? Okay. Yeah, this is great.
Yeah, no, it's an extraordinary memory, isn't it, of 5 years ago.
Yes.
And, over-claiming for the vaccines, saying they'll stop transmission, saying they're safe for kids, these have done real damage to vaccination, which is one of humankind's most important technologies. And we really daren't mess around with its reputation, in my view.
Yeah. Yeah, I just, again, I don't, even if you're a public figure, a mayor, governor, politician, or something, why not just say, well, we don't know for sure, but here's what we think this week, and here's what we're recommending, and we may change our mind if new evidence comes in. I mean, people respect that.
I agree, and I think there's somewhere along the line the idea that it's responsible to not admit uncertainty has become dogmatic in a lot of public health and other political science arenas, and I think that's very unhealthy.
Yeah, you're just handing it to the far right or the RFKJ or Dale Bigtree and these guys, just giving it to them.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel it myself. I personally am a big fan of vaccinations. I don't believe that the side effects are more important than the benefits for most diseases and for most age groups and things like that. But I'm beginning to wonder, what else am I being lied to about? And I need to go and look up the evidence myself. Now that, if someone like me who's been defending GMOs and vaccines all his career is worried about what he's been lied to about, then imagine what it's like for someone who is not so partisan on this issue.
Yeah. Joe Rogan just had on Bill Murray, the comedian from Saturday Night Live, who was recalling when Bob Woodward, the great Bob Woodward of the Washington Post, who broke the story about Watergate, wrote a big in-depth piece on John Belushi, who, Bill Murray was like best friends with and knew him intimately. And he said he got pretty much everything wrong in this story. And if he can't even get, the facts about some comedian's life right, what else am I reading that's just complete nonsense about important stuff like Watergate?
Wow. Well, actually, that is such an interesting topic, that the fact that whenever the newspapers discover something cover something about, you think, oh my God, they got that wrong. And yet you tend to believe it when it's something you don't.
Oh, here's what's going on in Ukraine. Okay, how would I know what's going on in Ukraine? I'll just take their word for it. Or 51 military leaders said that the Steele dossier or whatever that was true. Or no, was it the laptop? Yeah, it was that the Hunter Biden laptop was a Russian fake.
Yeah. No, and the damage that's been. We saw the media after Trump's election in 2016 say we've got to get off the fence and start being much less objective and tell people what to think on subjects. And so they then, made it come true what Trump was accusing them of.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I still hear there's fine people on both sides quote from Trump as if he's praising the Nazis, even though if you actually just watch the 2-minute clip, he doesn't say that.
Right.
And
Right.
it's been debunked, like 200 times, and still people just repeat. Anyways, okay, enough of that. Let me seg into your new book here with a little excerpt here from my very first column in Scientific American, which I called Darwin's Dictum. In 1861, less than 2 years after the publication of The Origin of Species in a session before the British Association for the Advancement of Science, a critic claimed that Darwin's book was too theoretical and that he should have just, quote, put his facts before us and let them rest. In a letter to his friend Henry Fawcett, who was in attendance in his defense, Darwin explained the proper relationship between facts and theory. Quote from Darwin. About 30 years ago, there was much talk that geologists ought only to observe and not theorize. And I well remember someone saying that at this rate, a man might as well go into a gravel pit and count the pebbles and describe the colors. And then here's his dictum that I quote. How odd it is that anyone should not see that all observation must be for or against some view if it is to be of any service.
Wow, that's a lovely quote. I've never heard that before. That's
Isn't that
brilliant.
great?
Yeah.
Yeah, so what is bird sex and beauty, the extraordinary implications of Darwin's strangest idea? What view is this for or against, and what's the problem to be solved?
It's for sexual selection, and it's for sexual selection being very different from natural selection, mate choice being a big driver of the way animals end up looking and behaving, much bigger than has been allowed for. And it's about how that version of evolution, sexual selection by mate choice, can produce much more eccentric, creative, colorful, and fun outcomes than natural selection. Natural selection is a pretty dull utilitarian beast, which, culls the unfit and leaves the sensible and sort of utilitarian creatures alive. Sexual selection says we're looking for people with extreme outfits who will catch the attention of the opposite sex and seduce. It's seduction of the hottest instead of survival of the fittest, as I now put it. My wife suggested that terminology to me. I want to give it its place in the sunlight. It's tended to be the poor relation of natural selection, either relegated to a small corner of evolution or, as in Darwin's lifetime, genuinely thought to be an incorrect theory. And I want to give it its place in the sun.
Yeah, nice. I think of this as almost a combination of David Attenborough and Richard Dawkins. You're out there in the field doing a kind of David Attenborough thing without a camera crew, I guess. And yet you're adding theory to it. So again, both facts and theory, looking at the beautiful colors on the head of the bird is
and
one
that's
thing.
A picture
that's
I
fine.
took. That's a picture I took with my own
you took
camera.
that. Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
So,
but why? Why is it that way? Yeah, that's the deeper question that I find interesting.
Michael, you wrote a wonderful biography of Alfred Russel Wallace, and he plays quite a big part in this book. Mainly, I think he was wrong. I mean, he was right about quite a lot, but he was wrong to reject Darwin's idea that females were the agents of selection of males and that this was driving the evolution of the whole species. He seems to have found it hard to understand that there was female agency in animals. And I think quite a lot of the Victorians at that very puritanical time, late Victorian England, struggled with the idea of female lust, female seduction, and maybe they didn't like to go home at the end of the day and explain to their wives that they'd been writing about such things. So there's a cultural background here that's interesting. But, Darwin and Wallace had this wonderful relationship where they liked each other, they agreed with a lot, they were generous to each other in terms of credit. And then there comes a moment when Wallace says, look, I don't agree with you that sexual selection is important, that female choice is driving the coloration of things like the peacock's tail. And Darwin's very hurt by this. He values Wallace's opinion, and they end up. And I owe the knowledge of this to a very good book by Evelyn Richards called The Making of Sexual Selection. And in it, she discovers that in September 1868, Wallace and Darwin have a weekend to hammer out their differences on this issue, and it doesn't work. They end up even further apart at the end of it. And Wallace is basically saying, look, there are other reasons why birds end up colourful. It's not because females are consistently choosing colourful males or males with long tails or whatever. And Darwin says, yes, I think that is what's happening. And in the end, by the time Darwin's dead, Wallace writes in his book, Darwinism, he really buries sexual selection theory at that point, and says that either the bright colours are there so that the females can identify the right species to mate with. Well, how come brown birds still manage to mate with the right species? Or he then raises an argument which is much more sensible and which comes to dominate sexual selection theory to this day, actually, but I think wrongly, and that is the idea that by choosing the most brightly coloured male, if they do that, females are simply choosing the strongest, and therefore it's just a form of natural selection. It's just natural selection at one remove. And Darwin says, no, I think they value beauty for its own sake, not because it tells you how powerful the male is. So that's the essence of the difference between these two men, which echoes down the generations in evolutionary biology, and which Ronald Fisher, Russell Landy, Mark Kirkpatrick, and more recently Richard Prum have wrestled to redress in favor of Darwin.
Yeah, I pulled out a couple of quotes from my biography of Wallace. Wallace explained how he thought his theory differed from Darwin's. Quote, sexual selection resulting from the fighting of males is indisputable. But differing from Darwin, I do not believe there's any selection through the choice of the females, and the drift of scientific opinion is toward my view. And then Wallace and Darwin differed on a number of important theoretical points, including, as enumerated by Wallace himself, quote, 1, the origin of man as an intellectual and moral being. 2, sexual selection through female choice. 3, Arctic plants in the southern hemisphere and on isolated mountaintops within the tropics. And 4, pangenesis and the heredity of acquired characteristics. So, what bothered Wallace was, why do we have such big brains? You know, a brain the size of a chimp is just fine for survival. And why do we have aesthetic appreciation and we could do mathematics and higher abstract reasoning? Why would natural selection ever select for that? And this led him to, as Darwin said, murder your own child and mine. That is, evolution itself, because he introduced then an idea of a higher power, kind of plopped in these extra abilities, whereas sexual selection, female choice, it does explain it. He had the answer right there. He didn't need to go to that. So my interpretation was Wallace is that he wasn't trying to sneak in God and religion and spiritualism for some woo-woo reason. He deduced it from being a pure adaptationist with natural selection only, and therefore there's these other problems that can't be solved, so therefore you have to turn to this higher power idea.
I think that's exactly right. I think, and there's a quote from Wallace somewhere in my book, I think, where he says, look, I'm being more Catholic than the Pope here. I'm the one who's
right.
really...
More Darwinian than Darwin, yeah.
Exactly. I'm taking this idea to more seriously and more logically. And there's an interesting point, actually, which I can't remember who first made this point, but as a contemporary historian has made this point, that after writing The Origin of Species, Darwin spends relatively little time on natural selection after that. He writes a book about domestication, which is, after all, artificial selection. He writes a book about the action of pollinators on plants and things like that, which again is a sort of, it's almost like he's flirting with intelligent design, in the sense that he's then, of course, The Descent of Man is about the role of females in directing evolution. So he's I don't mean to accuse him of being a creationist at all. Quite the reverse, of course. In some ways, he's more extreme than Wallace in that regard. But he is interested in where evolution is being guided by conscious creatures such as females choosing brightly colored males, such as human beings choosing certain kinds of pigeon. And in that sense, Wallace is the true defender of the faith of natural selection, and he wants to subsume sexual selection under natural selection. I've got a quote from him here from his 1877 book, Darwinism. As all the evidence goes to show that so far as female birds exercise any choice, it is of the most vigorous, defiant, and mettlesome males, this form of sexual selection will act in the same direction as natural selection and help to carry on the process of plume development to its culmination. And as I say, that became basically the dominant idea. I mean, Wallace also has this argument that males have more energy, so of course they've got to grow more feathers. Well, the premise is wrong. Males don't have more energy.
Right.
I certainly don't have more energy than my wife.
Yeah. Well, okay, so the basic initial argument in favor of sexual selection, again, just using your book cover and your own photograph, is that this is basically a signal to predators, here I am, come and get me. So how in the world could this possibly be selected for? And then the answer is, well, it's a proxy for something else, that my genes are so good, I can afford to grow something like this to attract females, and still it's a better payoff than the risk of being identified by predators.
Yes, but then Darwin is saying, no, I think it's beauty for its own sake. So, I've got a quote from him here again. The most refined beauty may serve as a sexual charm and for no other purpose. So he's saying this isn't about choosing the best male for survival. What is it about? And he doesn't end up with a good answer. And so no wonder, he loses the argument. But Fisher in 1930 provides an answer. He says, actually, if you think about it, the female could be selecting the ability of the male to survive so that her children will survive, or she could just be selecting the ability of the male to seduce so that her children can seduce. And once you start thinking about that idea, you see, that could run away. That could be a vicious circle. If what you're concerned about is the feature of your offspring that you want them to inherit is the ability to seduce females, suddenly that becomes a very powerful driving force, and you're going to get the peacock's tail and the preference for peacock's tails co-evolving in a runaway fashion. And that's the idea that I think has been insufficiently investigated and appreciated within sexuality. From time to time it has been, and as I say, Russell Landy and Mark Kirkpatrick did a very great job of pointing out that it works mathematically. But people like Julian Huxley basically said that's nonsense. You can't accept that theory. And why not? So in the end, I, of course, come down and say, yes, you can have both things going on at the same time. By choosing the best displayer, the female black grouse is getting good genes for disease resistance or whatever it might be for her offspring. But she's also getting good genes for persuading females to mate with them for her male offspring. And that could be the most important part of all.
Yeah, I wonder if there's something troubling scientists with the idea of beauty for its own sake. I mean, it's almost a philosophical idea. What do you mean for its own sake? And maybe it's something like if you apply game theory to why people are occasionally altruistic. It's it's sort of a calculation, a tit for tat. It's a reciprocal altruism, but no one's doing any calculating when they're being moral or immoral, right? They're just acting on their emotions. The emotions are a proxy for these natural selection doing the calculation. It's like the analogy I make is the waist to hip ratio of 0.67 or whatever it is that men find most attractive. Well, no one walks into a bar, doing calibrating waist to hip ratio. They're just like, oh, I like the look of that. Right. So it's just the emotions guiding us. But to say that, certain figures, like in men, broad shoulders, narrow waist or whatever, the hourglass figure in women are inherently beautiful. There's something about that, just, inherently beautiful. What What does that mean exactly, right? I think that troubles people.
And it does trouble people. You're quite right. And it also, human scientists say, hang on a minute, that's our topic. You biologists, you butt out. You're going to be reductionist at this. But I then get a bit personal and say, look, I find these birds beautiful. So do they find each other beautiful. We didn't share a common ancestor since 400 million years ago. It's unlikely that mammal-like reptile that was wandering around in the swamps of the Devonian period had the same ideals of beauty as us. So what is this coincidence? Why is it that when you show a film of almost any beautiful bird displaying, people say, oh, how lovely. They don't say, oh, how ugly or how strange. And actually, I then make a point, which I'm doing it partly for effect, but wish I was a bird. They're so much more attractive. They sing these beautiful songs. At the moment where I live, there's a wonderful dawn chorus already. The spring is on the way. There's no mammals contributing to that dawn chorus. Literally none at all. There's let alone reptiles or amphibians or anything. So a world without birds would be a silent, grim place. Likewise, mammals are brown, maybe sometimes
boring.
grey or black, but from a bird's point of view, mammals must just seem so ugly and
boring,
dull and grim.
That's really funny. Well, so then that brings up the question, why isn't the sexual selection mate choice happening on the same kind of scale for mammals than it did for birds?
Yeah, and some really interesting things about that. Number one, the way they invest in offspring is different. The internal gestation and lactation mean that the female is basically the one doing most of the rearing in mammals, but the there's the fertilization is different. Birds, on the whole, don't have penises. About 3% of them do, and those that do behave rather more like mammals. They tend to sort of pursue, seduce, and coerce females. Males do. And the loss of the penis has happened several times in birds, in most lineages of birds. It's not really quite clear why, but there's quite a good theory that it has enabled females to have more control over fertilization. And when you watch black grouse mating, it's very clear the female wanders unmolested among these males who frantically display to her, but they don't try and coerce her. They don't stop her leaving their own little territory and going into the next one. They just look disappointed when she does so. And then eventually she squats and invites mating, and she has to turn her tail up to make sure the two cloacas can meet each other. So there's very much female control of mating in birds. And this has given females the chance to say, I want males to be beautiful and seductive, not powerful and aggressive. Okay. Now that I want is not the right word, is it? I mean, I'm talking about evolution. So I'm being way too anthropomorphic here. But you can begin to see there's some kind of a theory in there that's quite intriguing. The genetics of birds are different as well. You've got the male being the heterogametic sex, the homogametic sex with, as it were, two X chromosomes. They're not called X in birds; they're called Z and Y, but Z and W. And it's the female that has the heterogametic combination of sex chromosomes. And I've seen an argument that this would lead to more sexual selection, more color, and so on. The laying of eggs, the ability for the male to get involved post fertilization. But none of these quite convince me as to why birds are more sexually selected. I wonder if it's because they fly, so it's much harder to coerce them. I mean, on the whole, birds that sort of control harems, like pheasants, are ground birds. They're not operating in 3 dimensions. An elephant seal really can dominate one part of the beach and make sure that the females in it are mated only with him. And she has to accept that. If she's on that part of the beach, she's owned by that male. A bird of paradise can flit off in any direction 3-dimensionally at great speed. And so the male, the only chance the male has got to persuade her to mate is to persuade her, not to control her. So I think there's something there too in the nature of flight.
Oh, that's super interesting. Yeah, that reminded me of Randy Thornhill, and I forget the other author of that Natural History of Rape book, which was so controversial. Correct. But, just what comes to mind is, so females are doing the choosing in mammals also, but the males can force themselves, thus rape, upon the female, whereas your argument here with the birds is they're not just choosing, they can also actually control it.
Correct. And by the way, it's usually females, but there are a small number of birds where it's the opposite, where brightly colored females compete to seduce dull males. Phalaropes, dotterels, jacanas, a number of other species, usually marsh birds for some reason. And there's they're really interesting. And Robert Trivers came up with this very good little theory of parental investment that basically whichever sex invests most in bringing up the offspring will be competed for by the other sex. And so the other sex will invest instead in seduction devices and displays and so on. And that works as a theory that, the fact that it's the male that sits on the eggs in phalaropes is the reason why it's female phalaropes that compete for males and not vice versa. Now, quite a lot of birds, and again, I'm finding birds more useful than mammals in drawing parallels for humans here. Quite a lot of birds, they have mutual sexual selection. So that you get brightly colored in both sexes, particularly birds that nest in holes, parrots, bee-eaters, kingfishers, but also a lot of seabirds, puffins, penguins, things like that. They grow bright feathers in the breeding season to seduce each other, but both sexes do it equally. And so a very good experiment was done in the 90s on crested auklets in the Pacific, which found that this is mutual sexual selection. In other words, if you exaggerate the ornament on either a male or a female crested auklet, it's quicker to acquire a mate. That's a bit more reminiscent of us. Both sexes are extremely choosy when they're choosing long-term sexual partners, and both sexes have an interest in the attractiveness of those partners, but in humans, the criteria for what's attractive in males and females is slightly different. And again, I've found just one bird species where that seems to be the case, and that's the paradise shelduck of New Zealand, where the female is a sort of brick red with a white head. The male is a sort of smart grey with a black head. They're both smart. They're both conspicuous, but they're differently so. And I'm very intrigued about that. I'm wondering if that's a nice parallel for us. Males and females are both considered beautiful, or beauty matters, but in different ways.
Indeed. Yeah. So the idea that there's different, mate selection strategies, and that if you're the species, or the so-called female of the species that produces large gametes versus the small gametes, and you have to carry to term the fetus and so on, you're much more risk averse, much more choosy and selective. Here, I'm just thinking of all the research from the evolutionary psychologists like David Buss, who now has these massive data sets from these dating sites. Just like millions of people take these surveys where, like, how many of the sites that you see here would you go out with that you find attractive, and you would ask out? The men, it was like, 85% I would go out with. The women, it was like 4.5%. I remember thinking, these poor guys have no chance.
Right.
Most of them.
But
Right.
when it comes to, but there's a big difference in his data between dates and long-term partners.
Yes.
When it comes to committing to a long-term partners, men are very, very choosy. I mean,
yes, that's right. Yeah,
almost by definition, that's the sort of story of most rom-com movies.
that's right. Yes, from cad to dad, and all of a sudden,
Yeah, exactly.
he's a good guy. But it does explain a lot. I'm continually amazed at how many people don't seem aware of this research. And now there's a slew of new books by women saying, feminists sold us a bad story that women can have all the free sex they want with as many men as they like, just like men can, and without any psychological problems. And that's just not the case. Maybe some women can, right? You have your British compatriot there. What's her name? Lily Phillips, who had sex with 100 men in one day as a kind of a an Instagram gimmick thing. But most
I
women
never quite understood what that was supposed to achieve, and I didn't really read the stories. So anyway.
Well, it's sort of an arms race on social media to see who can top the previous person to get the most eyeballs and clicks and donations. And the OnlyFans economic model is you get people to tip, $5, $5.
Okay.
And if you have 100,000 guys doing this, it adds up to some pretty serious money.
Yes.
But then you get like a Pareto distribution where, like 1% of the women are making 99% of the money. So within the 1%, they have to keep topping each other by doing crazier things.
Right.
Something like that. Yeah.
Right.
Anyway, but back to the bird. So let's divert here for a moment. I've read all your books. This is quite different.
Yes.
You went out into the field. Oh my God, these stories you have. So that's quite a shift from your kind of armchair theorizing that you usually do.
Absolutely.
What happened? What'd you do? Tell us the whole story.
Well, I've always been keen on bird watching. I did actually study sexual selection in birds before when I was still a scientist 40, 50 years ago. And I just thought to myself, why don't I try and make a book about my hobby of bird watching and my interest in this question of sexual selection. And then I can have the excuse and do a lot of bird watching and enjoy it. And maybe I can try my hand at writing a much more descriptive natural history book and much less of a sort of scientific or technical argument book. So there's some purple prose in here, as you've noticed.
Yeah, I liked it, though. It's nice. So what was it like? Where'd you go?
Well, the main thing I did was to watch this species called the black grouse, which quite near where I live. There are places where they breed, and I habituated a couple of the leks, these places where the birds gather, very, very predictably, the same place every day for months on end and every year. So you know exactly where to place your blind or your or vehicle to watch from. And I got in the habit of watching these and started, deciding that it would be fun to write up the experience of what I'm seeing, but also look up the science that's been done on this species, mainly in Finland, and interpret what I'm seeing with the help of scientific research. So it's a bit of both. But then I went to the Arctic to look for species like ruffs, and went to a Norwegian mountain to do an extraordinary species called the great snipe, which does this predictable lecking, communal displaying at midnight in a marsh on top of a mountain, having flown from Africa a few months before and about to go back there. And then I went to Australia to see the birds of paradise in New Guinea and the bowerbirds, which are, I think, the most extraordinary of all these birds that effectively create art installations where they can decorate special structures with flowers or colored objects, bits of plastic and things like that. And that is their form of elaborate display instead of their own plumage. And that, of course, has even closer parallels to what human beings do.
You want to talk about extended phenotype in the bowerbird and how what they're doing is slightly different from the actual body plumage, or actually it's quite similar?
Yeah. So The bowerbirds are quite closely related to the birds of paradise, and some of the bowerbirds are extremely colourful, but they build only rather rudimentary bowers. The ones that build spectacular and dramatic bowers are really quite dull looking themselves. It's as if they've sloughed off the colour from their own bodies onto their own art installations. So the satin bowerbird, which I watched, is a sort of dark blue bird that builds grass bowers, these sort of little avenues of grass in the dried grass, and then decorates it with blue objects. So blue feathers, blue flowers, blue plastic things. The golden bowerbird builds two great big ziggurats of sticks with a branch between them, and either end of the branch it puts a little collection of lichen and flowers, white things. The great bowerbird, which I had an extraordinary morning watching in the edge of a cemetery on the edge of a town, he builds a bower out of sticks, and then on the platform of sticks in front of it, he puts a lot of white and grey objects, and then a line of green objects, and then a line of red objects. So, colour-coded decorations. Now, the white and grey objects in this case were nearly all man-made things like bottle tops, bits of glass, and toys. There's a toy hand grenade and a toy tiara at the bower that I watched. But when the female came to the bower while we were watching, he went off to the red collection and picked up a red chili pepper and brought that and paraded in front of her, making a buzzing noise, saying, "Look at me, aren't I clever? I have chili peppers too." Now, there have been some really neat experiments in which, for the satin bowerbird, they've enhanced some birds' bowers. They've given them extra bits of plastic, and they've reduced the attractions of others by taking bits of blue plastic away. And sure enough, it has a big effect on whether the bowerbird attracts a mate with young females, not with older females who are already decided which male they like. So, there's a lot of complication going on here.
And where are they getting this stuff? Is there like a local trash dump or something?
I think, yeah. I mean, in the case of the experiment, they actually positioned in the environment. They put piles of little bits of blue plastic out for the birds to collect, and then they signed. They removed bits from one bird and added bits to another, so that they knew that the bird was, so they could control how much color the bird had. But it's a slightly sad feature of the modern world that a lot of bowerbirds are now using man-made objects, and in the blue carton caps on water bottles, the blue water bottle tops, have now been changed color in Australia so that they don't all end up collected by bowerbirds.
It's too funny. Why? Who cares?
Well, it's litter,
it's litter. I see. Yeah. Okay.
I guess.
Right. Yeah. Right. I just thought of something crazy. Nagel's "What's It Like to Be a Bat?" Well, if you look at a bowerbird display and think, well, that is really striking and beautiful, that it's a reasonable interpretation that they're also feeling that or thinking that. That's in their sentience.
That's kind of where Darwin started. I mean, he talks about how strange it is that birds and us seem to. He says that they have a greater aesthetic ability than any other creature, save man. I think he says. Now, I've got the quote here actually. Birds appear to be the most aesthetic of all animals, excepting, of course, man, and they have nearly the same taste for the beautiful as we have. And that's, maybe that's where the appeal of bird watching comes from. We've got this, we bird watchers have this fellow feeling with birds. You like colours, you like songs, so do we.
Yeah.
And when you see a sort of grunting hippopotamus, you don't have quite the same instant feeling of recognition.
You want to mention costly signaling theory and how that is different from what we're talking about here?
Yeah. So the handicap theory, which was put into words by Amos Zahavi in the 1970s, said maybe the cost of growing a peacock's tail is the point of it. The fact that you've survived despite having to carry around this conspicuous ornament shows that you're a mate worth having. And that essentially is part of a sort of costly signaling theory group of ideas. And that's still a very popular idea here in sexual selection theory. But I'm mostly not persuaded by it because I think, yes, that is part of the story. But if it's so costly that it's stopping you survive, then how come it's worth passing on to your kids? Surely the point is this device has helped you mate, and therefore it's not costly. Yes, it may be costly in terms of survival, but that is made up for in fact that it's actually a benefit in terms of seduction. It's hard to pin down the actual examples where costly signaling theory adds up. Yes, there is some evidence that by choosing brightly colored mates, females get disease resistance genes for their offspring. There is some evidence, for example, in the black grouse that having an enormous sort of chrysanthemum of white feathers around the rear end, which is conspicuously displayed, you're not going to get away with having diarrhea in the mating season. Things like that. But what that theory can't do is explain why sexual selection goes off in such weird directions. Costly signaling would probably zero in on 2 or 3 ways of quite simply and quite purely measuring the viability of males. Growing a long tail, being big would be the sort of obvious things. Instead of which we get every conceivable color, we get every, if you think of just about the birds of paradise, you get the most extraordinary and ridiculous displays. You get ultra black in some species. You get blue skin on the head in one species. Mm-hmm. What's that all about? Why these very, very different and varied ways of displaying that you've got a high quality male? It seems to make no sense unless you accept that there's an arbitrariness about this, that anything can get exaggerated in any direction. And for
this is the one. Yeah, you feature this. It's in black and white, but I remember Attenborough had a whole segment on this bird, and it is just striking. It's incredible how the colors, and
it's the most bizarre thing because you can't see any features of the bird. It's like a black hole. And its black feathers, Richard Prum told me this, are so black that they're blacker than the blackest black paint we've invented.
They
capture 99.95% of the light that falls on them. So cameras can't focus on this bird when it's turned inside out, and it's a shapeshifter, and then it projects this smiley face on the black hole. And how does it do that? Well, it's a set of feathers catching the light in a certain way, but they're nothing like the feathers when the bird's at rest. The bird looks completely different when it's hopping around than when it adopts this bizarre black hole characterization. It's called the superb lophorina, that bird. And Tim Lamon has taken that photograph of it. He's filmed it. David Attenborough's featured it with Tim Lamon's film, I think. But, it's very rare for anybody to have seen it do this display. And it was only a few years ago that we realized that it could do this shape-shifting transformation. There's, the birds of paradise are, as I say, sexual selection's masterpieces.
Yeah. Also, presumably in a Darwinian way, it would have to be a gradual development into that final product. So there would have to be many
potentially
steps.
Quite fast. I think one of the features of sexual selection is because of this runaway effect. It can happen quite quickly, and you might be it might be hard to catch it in the act. I talk about some species, including the great snipe, where I think it hasn't really started to transform the plumage. And if we watch closely over the next 10,000 years, we might see it happen pretty dramatically. That doesn't sound fast, but it is dramatically fast in evolutionary terms.
Yeah. Well, so that brings up, evolutionary arms races and the Baldwin effect, which is one of my favorite parts of the book. You have that picture of your computer mouse and your Acheulean hand axe. Here, let me show that, which I saw. I think you had this in your office when I was at your house years ago. You featured that in one of your books.
Yeah. I still think that picture sums up, a million years of innovation, the difference between us and them, and so on.
I've got some hand axes, actual hand axes. Check these out.
What?
Yeah, they're beautiful. I mean, just to hold it. I mean, these aren't replicas. These are the actual thing. And this one is just nicely, smoothly.
So that one's what you call a Neolithic one, i.e. that polished one.
Yes, this one's a little older, I think.
That one's more like an Australian one, yeah.
They have numbers on them, but I have a feeling it was archaeologists who added those numbers. But okay, so explain the Baldwin effect, because this is so interesting. You really have to kind of think it through to see what's going on here, because it's not an inherited characteristics in a Lamarckian way.
So James Mark Baldwin said, if there's a cultural habit that is picked up by our species, let's say we start drinking milk as adults, we start milking cows, then there will be selection pressure on us to be born with adaptations that suit that habit. So, and that has happened in the case of drinking milk. We are now born with a lactase gene that remains switched on in adulthood in most human races, or some human races. So the genes have taken what was a cultural habit and turned it into an instinct or a genetic predisposition. Now, that's not a behavioral one, that's a physiological one. But if you then turn that into a behavioral one and say, look, in our species, we have developed the habit of doing something like making a stone axe, making stone axes. Would people who had a genetic tendency to be keen on making stone axes and be good at making stone axes leave more offspring? Yes, they would, because they've got a natural advantage here. And does that mean that after a while, what was cultural is going to become innate? It's actually going to turn into a genetic propensity. And we think of things going the other way. We think of human beings giving up on instincts and turning over to learning instead. But sometimes the opposite is going to happen, and stuff is going to start out cultural and end up genetic. The bowerbirds, I think, may well be a good example of this. Some bowerbirds, just out of to be different, started collecting these objects, and after a bit, the instinct to develop these objects got selected. So this is a challenge to the idea that human beings have become less instinctive and more cultural over time. It's quite possible that some things have gone the other way. And the reason this is related to the axe is that the Australian hand axe is so similar all over the world for nearly 1 million years that it doesn't look like habit. It looks like an instinct.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like, like a bird's nest. Birds' nests are similar in the same species all over the world and for millions of years. The suggestion has been made that we had an instinct to build these things, and that instinct may not have been entirely driven by natural selection. It could have been driven by sexual selection. In other words, if you can't make a good hand axe, beautifully symmetrical, too symmetrical to be practical, actually, then you didn't get to mate. You can say, well, that's a pretty far-fetched idea, but so is every other idea for what was the purpose of the Australian hand axe, if you see what I mean. And so what we're getting at here is trying to make the sexual selection theory not a last resort theory, but a first resort theory. Why shouldn't it be like that? And then we get into the question of whether or not the human brain itself was sexually selected, and the reason it ran away to such large size in such a short time was because actually mates were doing the choosing. It wasn't the environment that was doing the choosing. It was each other in both sexes. And
because you
like
often hear, intelligence is really great for solving problems of survival, so it would have been naturally selected for, and therefore having big brains is an adaptive feature. Well, if it's so great, how come we're the only ones with huge brains like this, other than dolphins, right? I mean, most species do just fine with small little brains.
Exactly. That's a real problem for the natural selection theory. And then there's the social brain theory, which says, no, we needed big brains to solve the problem of living in complicated societies with each other. And that's a good theory too. But then the third one is the sexual selection theory, that actually wit, humor, intelligence, verbal dexterity, musical ability were the kinds of things that we valued in each other as a mate. And so we drove more and more of it, and that required bigger brains in both sexes, by both sexes being selected.
Yeah, in both sexes, yeah. Well, so something comes to mind. So if the, say, male is really good at chipping this stone, and then therefore he's a more successful hunter or processor of meat or whatever, and therefore he gets more mates, is she really selecting for the ability to do this, or this is a proxy for just a more successful male hunter, something like that?
Yeah, exactly. And that really is, in a sense, the difference between Wallace and Darwin. Wallace is saying, yeah, but she's just finding a way to pick a good hunter so that he provides for her offspring, and her offspring are more likely to survive. And Darwin is saying, in some sense, the artifact has become important because she values the ability to make the artifact in her mate. So do other females in her tribe. And therefore she needs to have sons who are good at making artifacts, because otherwise they won't get mates. That's the Fisher version of the Darwin argument, which is logically very powerful, actually. It sounds circular, but it is circular. But
what's that called? There was something like the handsome sons theory. It wasn't called
sexy
that.
son.
Sexy sons. That's it.
Yeah.
Is that Fisher?
So that is essentially the Fisher idea. Yeah, he didn't use the phrase "sexy son," but that was what he was saying. He put it rather neatly. Actually, I've got a quotation from him. He corresponded with Darwin's grandson, Charles Galton Darwin, who was a mathematician who didn't like his idea at all, despite the fact that it was justifying the grandfather's theory. He said, "My theory is that tasteful hens don't rear more chicks, but their sons are finer and get more grand chicks." So what he's saying is that if females are motivated by their appreciation of the beauty of the males, then it doesn't help them have more babies, but it does help their sons attract a mate, and that will get them more grand chicks. I like the phrase grand chicks. So that was a letter from Fisher to Charles Galton Darwin in 1932, and there's a background here. Fisher was a eugenicist of a pretty shocking kind to our ears, in the sense that he was advocating for deliberate selection of human beings. And in a sense, his theory is anti-eugenic. It's saying, no, we're not interested in improving the race of peafowl. We're just interested in having fun seeing how big we can make the tail. And maybe that's why although he advanced this theory, he never really, and we learned only recently that he did actually do a mathematical model of it. and he was a very distinguished mathematician. But he never published that mathematical model. So maybe it didn't fit with his political prejudices, this theory, which is a possibility and a slightly strange one.
We're just looking up something in one of my books on terror management theory. Have you heard this? Do you know this?
No.
This is based on Ernst Becker's book, The Denial of Death, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1973. The basic argument is that because we're the only species aware of our own mortality, we're terrorized by the idea we're going to die. So we do things to kind of overcome this terror and imagine we're leaving behind our legacy through art, architecture, monumental architecture, intelligence, all this kind of stuff, creativity. That's been turned into a whole theory, terror management theory. Psychologists Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pizensky. And their book is The Worm at the Core on the Role of Death in Life. And they say basically everything, all of civilization is driven by this idea that we're just terrorized of our death. Anyway, when I started looking at this, like, yeah, why are humans so artistic in architecture? Why do we make monumental architecture and that sort of stuff? So that led me to reading then Geoffrey Miller's book, The Mating Mind. Of course, his argument is quite the opposite of that. Is like, no, that's not where we're not just terrorized about the fear of death. There's some other positive motive, and that leads into what you're talking about here, because you talk about Geoffrey Miller toward the end of your book. So explain, because I tried to explain to somebody yesterday what your book is about. Ultimately about, the evolution of humor and wit and intelligence and all that. They're like, oh, come on. How would that be naturally selected for? No. Female selection, right?
Yeah.
So explain how, what humor would do, or why being witty and intelligent and thoughtful and that kind of thing.
Well, I should preface it by saying this is a book about birds. And I say rather plaintively at one point, look, this isn't a book about one African ape.
Right.
Will you guys stop being so obsessed with one African ape?
Yeah.
But
we can't help it.
As one of the reviewers has said, you can hear the voice of the editor saying, no, you've got to address humans. And of course, I am interested in humans too. And this African ape is, it's not as interesting as birds, but it's still interesting. So the argument goes, what's the point of telling jokes? What's the point of singing songs? What's the point of quite a lot of human behavior to which we devote quite a lot of energy and effort? Maybe it's social glue for holding us together in the Pleistocene. Maybe it's to stop us getting bored. Well, those are perfectly reasonable theories. But maybe it's what it kind of says on the tin, which is that we're trying to seduce each other with this stuff. Mm-hmm. That our peacock's tail is our sense of humor and our singing ability and all that. Because after all, what do pop stars sing about? Love. And what do pop stars get when they
lots of love,
make a hit record? Lots of screaming women or men or whatever it is. And what do people say about humor and sex? It's a very striking phenomenon. I cite one of the late Helen Fisher's studies, showing that an awful lot of people say, I fell in love with my wife or husband because of the sense of humor. And it's very important to me. What is it they say in the agony columns? I mean, the Lonely Hearts columns, GSOH, good sense of humor essential, etc. So
I've never heard that one. That's funny.
It looks like it's a reasonable explanation for how we ended up devoting so much of our grey matter to wit and showing off and singing and music and verbal dexterity. Maybe because that was the way we got the best possible mate. And if mates minded about that, then we had to get good at that, because otherwise our kids wouldn't get mates. It can be a runaway process. And Geoffrey Miller made that point very eloquently in his book, The Mating Mind, 25 years ago. And nobody's really followed it up in a way that I think they should have done, that I think would have been, there isn't a great study of mating minds to the extent that people talk about the evolution of big human brains. They still talk purely about natural selection explanation, which might be right. I'm not saying this is definitely right, but I'm saying why not let's consider and work through the implications of and think about how we would test the sexual selection theory of the mind. Because look at the birds. Sexual selection can have a big impact on species, and don't underestimate it as a force.
Yeah. Well, you've done so convincingly, I think, in your book. So maybe this will lead to further research. I forget if this is in Miller's book or somewhere else, but everybody knows women like men that are taller than them. And now you don't have this problem, but I am. I'm 5'8". Okay, I lied. I don't know why I lied. I'm 5'7". All right. But there was a study showing that for each college degree you have, I think you get, in the perception of females, you're 1 inch taller. And I thought, well, I have, or maybe it was 2 inches taller for each degree anyway. I thought, yeah, because it was 2 inches, because I have 3 degrees. So I thought, oh, finally I'm 6 foot, like I always wanted to be. Yeah. And so maybe there's studies on this that I don't know about. Maybe being funny gives you the equivalent of 2 inches per level of humor that you have, or something like that.
Well, there's some. I believe it's Napoleon who said, "If you can make a woman laugh, you can conquer." Right. Well, that's a little bit on the sexist side, I think, and the word conquer is not ideal in this day and age, and Napoleon is not exactly a role model for good behavior. But he was more interested in conquering countries than women, I think, on the whole.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
So it's probably apocryphal anyway, but certainly people talk about, wealth is an aphrodisiac, so is humor, like that. So
and power.
And power, exactly. Yes. No, so there's a lot going on in human beings, and we are mammals, and there's quite a lot of mammal stuff, i.e., let's see how many females we can coerce into mating with us, or let's see how much success we can have in attracting females by beating up other males. That's a much more sort of mammalian way of going about it. The peacocks and black grouse and things, they just say, "Please watch my phasing display where I sing and dance." Well, hang on, we do a bit of that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Helen Fisher told me a funny story. Well, kind of funny story on some of this research. She had a few drinks. We were at a party. So she goes, "You know what really keeps a woman? If the guy can make her come." I'm like, "Helen?" She goes, "Oh, yeah, you have no idea how attractive that is." I'm like, okay, that's good to know. And, so much research in this area has been done by men, right? So it was good to have people like Helen Fisher, Marty Hazelton, and other women that have dove into, evolutionary psychology, because it is very different.
Absolutely. Sarah Hurdy, many other wonderful
Sarah Hurdy,
women.
right? You know what?
Great work.
Like that book that Cindy Meston and David Buss wrote together, Why Women Have Sex. I mean, that was an eye-opener. It's like revenge sex and boredom sex. I'm like, what? Really? I had no idea. How come I didn't learn this in sex education?
Yeah. Well, of course, the disadvantage of studying humans is that you can't do experiments. You can't do what we do in, there's this famous sexual selection experiments in widow birds that Malty Anderson did in the 1980s in Kenya, where he took a bunch of males, and some of them he left alone. Others he cut their tails and stuck them back together, and those were controls. Others he cut their tails and lengthened the tail, and others he cut their tails and shortened the tails. And sure enough, the ones where he lengthened the tail ended up getting more females nesting in their territory and presumably mating with them. So it would be, we could do that in human beings, couldn't we? We could deliberately reduce your sense of humor by giving you a drug that made you less funny, or deliberately increase your sense of humor and see whether or not you mated with more females. but it would be unethical in human beings. So
an IRB is not going to
paradoxically-
approve that.
Exactly. Quite right. I'm definitely not advocating such experiments, you understand.
But it's a kind of a form of super stimuli. So maybe talk about that for a minute.
Well, yeah, but I just wanted to quickly make the final point that that's why paradoxically we find humans harder to understand than animals, because we can't do those kind of controlled experiments. Superstimuli is a really interesting point. And Nico Tinbergen famously pointed out that if you give a herring gull an egg that's bigger than a herring gull egg, it finds it more exciting to sit on it than a real size. And there does seem to be some sense in which, birds have a fairly simple thing saying, a big version of something I like is even better than a normal sized version. And maybe that drives things like peacock's tails. The bigger they get, the better, the more exciting they are. And what's probably going on here is an arms race between the seducer and the seduced. And it takes more and more stimulation to persuade the female to mate in something like a peacock. A million years ago, you only needed a few spots on your tail and the female would mate with you. Now you need 170 spots on your tail before a female will even consider mating with you. So resistance to being seduced is sort of the same thing as choosiness.
So if we all look like Brad Pitt, there'd be an arms race to get even better looking.
Exactly. And that probably culturally does happen a bit. If you're living in a town where everybody's pretty hideous, you don't have to be all that good looking to be popular with the opposite sex. If you're living in a town where everybody is stunning, I don't know, Hollywood, I suppose, then it's pretty hard to stand out from the crowd.
Oh my God, these pictures from like the late 19th century, like 1870s or 80s of men and women. I mean, it's like, ugh, oh God. I mean, nobody looks like that today. Everybody's better looking. Now, maybe just, it's a pure cultural thing, but
You
wow.
mean sort of Victorian porn when they first started taking pictures of themselves with their clothes off?
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. No, I agree. Yes. No.
But there's. I was thinking of the Mormons with the polygamy thing. And you see these pictures of these guys, and then all the women. It's like, I'm not going for the polygamy thing at all. I mean, they don't. This isn't all Jennifer Aniston and Brad Pitt.
Well, the guys were nothing to write home about with their long greasy beards and
hideous.
And,
terrible
hair plaited, matted down.
Yes.
And they must have smelt too.
I don't even want to think about it. All right, here's what you write here. The neglect of sexual selection in the study of human beings has left anthropology, psychology, economics, political science, and even social policy the poor. Miller thinks there's a gap where the theory of sexual selection should be. From Marx to Freud to Veblen to Foucault to Chomsky, theories of human nature in the 20th century were mostly failures, hollowed out by their neglect of possibly the most powerful of all evolutionary forces shaping the human mind, mate choice. So let's wrap it up there, talking about the largest implications for our understanding of human nature.
Yep, I think my purpose in this book, apart from enjoying writing about birds and getting other people to enjoy the bird scenery, is to say there's a really important force at large in the world called mate choice, which is shaping evolution. It's not the same as natural selection, and we've tended to underplay its importance.
Nice. Yeah. Because even setting aside the blank slater people of human nature, even if you accept an evolutionary model, it's still limited. If it's just natural selection, you're saying we need to add sexual selection.
Exactly.
That's great, Matt. Great book. Thanks for coming on to talk about it. What are you working on next? I mean, I know this just came out, so we'll post this on the pub date.
Give me a break.
Give me a break. Come on. You're always noodling away at some problem you're going to write about in the future.
You write a book a year, don't you, Michael?
No, it's about every 3 years. 3 years. It takes me 3 years.
Well, I'm 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Would you see it as almost a bookend to your first book? Red Queen was your first book, right?
Very much so. Yeah, my Red Queen was my first book, and that has quite a bit about sexual selection in it. It's also about the evolution of sex itself. And so this is a different book, but in some sense a sequel. Not directly, but it covers some of the same ground.
Yeah. Well, on that question, why is there sex? Has biologists been wrangling with that for a while. Has that changed since the Red Queen was written?
I think there's been a lot of new experiments one way or another, but I don't think the basic debate has been resolved. But I think it's settled down to two possible theories. One is the parasite theory, and the other is the genetic mutation theory. And that sex is a way of combating deleterious mutations, or sex is a way of combating harmful parasites. But either way, shuffling the genes is an important benefit, not just for the species, but for the individual lineage.
Yeah. All right. Perfect. Good place to end it. Thanks, Matt. Congratulations on the new book.
Thank you, Michael. Great to talk to you.